What's up, guys? Welcome to our next installment of the mini series that we're doing. Today, we are talking about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers with new quarterback Tom Brady. I'm so glad he's out of my division. I have him projected out at about 4,100 yards, 28 passing touchdowns to 9 interceptions. He is going to be a burner on the ground with 35 yards
More than
and
Philip Rivers.
five more than Philip Rivers and 2 touchdowns. He tends to
Ooh.
well, not tends to, but he does have some opportunity getting down at the goal line and kind of sneaking one in. So I got him for two. I'm gonna give him an extra touchdown this year on the ground. So 2 touchdowns for him for a total of 332 fantasy points. Um, there's really not much behind them. They don't have Jameis Winston anymore. They got Blaine Gabbert, who isn't really a
Mhm.
threat to anybody. Ryan Griffin, who isn't really a threat to anybody. But if Tom Brady goes down, this whole offense kind of stinks. But as long as Tom Brady's there, they got some weapons, and we're going to talk about them. And this is probably going to be one of our longest shows yet because they got a lot to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, lots of fantasy relevance here. I mean, I think it would be very entertaining to watch Blaine Gabbert in this offense, just for the record. But that wouldn't be great from a fantasy standpoint. So, going into Tom Brady, the Bucs obviously with Bruce Arians run a very pass-happy offense, one of the most pass-happy in the NFL. Over the past 2 seasons, they've had the fourth most pass attempts, so they haven't been number one. The Falcons have been number one for a few years now, and they tend to go that way. And it's kind of interesting when you look at it. There's a lot of hate for Tom Brady. A lot of people who say he's not going to be a QB1 this year. I mean, you're just hating on Tom Brady then. I mean, when you really look at it, he has no reason not to finish between this offense. He only had 13 fewer pass attempts than Jameis last year, which I thought was kind of interesting. And he finished as the QB 12 last season for fantasy purposes. So I expect a big difference between last year with the Patriots and this year, though, to be just a supporting cast. When you think about who's left over with the Patriots now, I mean, their receivers and tight ends are not good
Mm-hmm.
when you look at their position players. And it's interesting, they actually have a newer metric from last season called supporting cast efficiency, which just measures all your receivers, tight ends, running back. So I thought that was an interesting metric. And Tom Brady's was number 17 with the Patriots last year in terms of his skill position players. And Jameis had number 6 with the Buccaneers. So that's a pretty big difference. And not to mention, they have Gronk now. So that's just another weapon for him. They've tried to improve that offensive line. So there's not much to hate about Tom Brady, if we're being honest here. I mean, he continues to slip in drafts because he's old and people don't want Tom Brady. If you want to be realistic about it, but if there's one negative, it will be that his completion percentage was really poor last year when he was under pressure. He actually was 31st in the NFL in terms of completing passes when he was under pressure. This offensive line is improving, but they were really poor last year, so that's a little bit of a concern. But I mean, as long as they can block for 1.5 seconds, he just needs enough time to get the ball out of his hands to these weapons.
Yep, that's all he needs. He's been ripping teams apart under 2 seconds every every pass back.
Yeah.
Um, Probably their most boring part of the offense is the running backs because we don't know who it's going to be. Ronald Jones goes into another year under Bruce Arians. He has a leg up. Rookie running backs and first year running backs under Bruce Arians haven't really been very successful. And Keyshawn Vaughn, even though he's a third round pick, they put a little stock into him. I don't know where exactly he's going to fit in just yet. Ronald Jones, he has been a little bit of a disappointment, especially as a second round pick with the Bucs over the past couple of years. But last year he did kind of turn it on towards the end of the season. Um, it's probably going to be a split for a lot of the season unless one of these two kind of breaks it away. Behind them, really, there really isn't much. I mean, Dare Ogunbowale, I don't even know if I'm saying his name right. He was forced into some games last year because of injuries and opportunity, but he's not really going to be a threat at all. It's going to be down to these two, Ronald Jones and Keyshawn Vaughn. But it's just a matter of where you want to draft them and if you're going to trust them. And I've actually seen, and we actually did a mock draft with a couple of the admins. I've seen a guy towards the turn take one of them and then take the other on the way back just
Hmm.
to kind of solidify it. You're probably looking at that kind of situation in your draft if you want to guarantee that you have a piece of this Tampa team and in the backfield. But again, that's two picks that you're putting into one position and essentially one player because you don't want to get 600 yards out of each player. You want to get 1,200 out of one, and that's basically how it is. But yeah, I mean, what's your thoughts on these running backs here, and who do you think could be the lead by the end of the season?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of hype around Keyshawn Vaughn when he first got drafted. I mean, I saw him fly off draft boards, and I mean, he's a very underwhelming running back when you look at his college career. I think he's once again one of those guys for me. He's going to be a better real life running back. He was graded by a lot of scouts as the strongest pass blocking back in the NFL. So I just talked about how poor their offensive line was last season. I think Keyshawn Vaughn could be one of those picks to almost solidify their offensive line, which sounds a little strange to say. So I don't expect him to have a ton of work in terms of fantasy relevant. He'll catch some passes because he'll probably have work on third downs. But to me, it's still Ronald Jones. He's going as the 31st running back off the board. Keyshawn Vaughn 34th, so they're really close, as you just kind of alluded to. You can realistically get them on a turn and make sure you cover yourself. But I really like Ronald Jones. I mean, being the 31st running back off the board, you're looking more at a flex play. For me personally, in the way I draft, probably your fourth or fifth running back, which is even better. But last season, under the radar, he had 1,000 total yards and 6 touchdowns, 31 receptions. And not that that's overly impressive, but I mean, I take it semi seriously when you have over 1,000 total yards. I mean, that's nothing to sneeze at. So I like Ronald Jones, and if he's given the opportunity, I think he could be a top 20 back with a little bit of upside coming off the board 31st overall. So, in my opinion, that's the guy to own. I think he'll be involved. Not that I think he's a three down guy, just based on Keyshawn Vaughn's strength as a pass blocker. But I do think for fantasy purposes, Jones is still the guy to own.
All right, and then moving on to their offensive line, as we both kind of mentioned, they're not really that good. They drafted Tristan Wirfs with their first round pick this year. I mean, technically they traded up for him. They moved up one spot to get him. They swapped with the 49ers in that
Yeah.
spot. But so I mean that it's definitely a start to that offensive line, but they're really not that good overall. But again, as you said, Doc, they have to stay upright, keep Tom Brady upright for less than 2 seconds so he can get the ball out of his hands.
Yeah, and Pro Football Focus heading into next season has them ranked as the 13th offensive line, which I was a little surprised to read. They were ranked 22nd. They were ranked last season, so towards the bottom half of the league. But they drafted Wirfs. Pro Football Focus and their analytics loves Wirfs. I mean, to me, he's an unrefined guy. I think he needs to. That's why they're not starting him at left tackle right away. They have Donovan Smith at left tackle, Wirfs at right tackle, just because he needs to work on his game a little bit. He's a super athletic guy, but some of his footwork and specifics are a little off right now. So I think this is an improved offensive line compared to last season. And when you look at it, they did improve quite a bit the second half of last season, as did a lot of things with the Buccaneers. And we'll talk about that when we talk about their defense. But if this young offensive line continues to improve, they'll be a top half of the league unit, which is all really Tom Brady needs.
Yep, exactly. Now getting into their bread and butter, it's only really two guys, but it's two of the better guys at this position in the league, and that's wide receiver. You got Mike Evans, who is just a monster, and then you got Chris Godwin, who kind of had a breakout over the course of last year and a little bit of the year before. But those two are your top guys. Those two are going close to each other in drafts. I mean, realistically, if you wanted, you can probably get both of them towards the end of the second at the turn. If you have a late second round pick and then you want to grab another one in the third, but then you're kind of handcuffing yourself, grabbing two weapons from the same team. But I mean, they're probably going to do a lot of work. Mike Evans he's the definition of consistency. if there's any stat line that you want to bet, it's bet that he's going to get 77 receptions, 1,300 yards, and 8 touchdowns, because that's basically what he's done his whole. That's what he's done his whole career ever since he came into the league. That's what he averages out. He's an excellent red zone threat. He's one of the best receivers in the league. I mean, Godwin is probably going to be the favorable one in this offense because Tom Brady, and people say that he's lost a step in his arm and it's not as strong as what it used to be, and that's Mike Evans' strength. But it's his receivers that he's had to work with, which is why he has those short routes. Julian Edelman, a little bit of just throughout his career, Wes Welker, he's had Danny Amendola. I mean, those are the guys that he likes to hit over the middle, and that's where Chris Godwin is going to go. But Mike Evans is still going to he's going to do what Mike Evans does. The only other guy that I really like from this team is their 5th-round pick, Tyler Johnson, and I like him because of the defensive command that Chris Godwin and Mike Evans are gonna take. So Tyler Johnson, if he's on there in 3 receiver sets, now they got a trio of tight ends that we're going to talk about, where 2 of them are probably going to be on the field at all times too. So how much is Tyler Johnson going to be on the field? I don't know. He could be a good long-term option too, especially if they decide to move on from a Mike Evans or Chris Godwin. I mean, I hope they don't. I think that's a good pair for years to come. But if they get too expensive and if they got to lose one, Tyler Johnson could kind of come in and be a solid wide receiver. But this year, if he's going to be getting if he's going to get some snap share, if he's going to get some targets there from Tom Brady, I think he could be a solid wide receiver.
Yeah, and I agree with your assessment on the Patriots wide receivers. I mean, who was their deep threat last season? I don't even know who you could consider a deep threat. I mean, with Edelman, they had Mohamed Sanu last year, Ben Watson. I mean, none of those guys are really deep threats, but impressively enough, he had the 10th most completed air yards in the league. I mean, I don't even know how that's possible, honestly. And I don't know who any of those completions were to. But, I mean, he really hasn't lost much on his deep ball. And that's been the narrative in the fantasy community is like, oh, Mike Evans' career is over. I mean, for some of these takes, you would legitimately think that Mike Evans is never going to catch a pass in the NFL again.
Yep.
But the reality is, I think Chris Godwin and Mike Evans are the 2nd and 3rd most talented wide receivers Tom Brady has ever played with, behind Randy Moss. I mean, he's never dealt with and overall, this is the most talented skill position group with Godwin, Evans, Gronk, O.J. Howard, Cameron Brate. He's never had this much talent on an offense in his entire career, and I'm assuming that's one of the reasons why he went to Tampa, and not to mention who doesn't want to live in Tampa, but
ready to retire.
I mean, it's perfect, honestly, but there's not much to say about Godwin and Evans, in my opinion. These are 2 top 10 guys. I don't have any doubts about either one of them. So, I mean, maybe it would be a little more interesting if I didn't think Evans was going to be a threat this year. I mean, I do prefer Godwin just because Tom Brady has shown a propensity to favor those intermediate slot guys. Godwin ran over 50% of his routes out of the slot last year. When you look at their average target distance, it doesn't surprise you. Mike Evans was 4th in the league in deep targets. Chris Godwin was 61st. So I do prefer Godwin just because I think he'll have more volume on shorter routes. But that doesn't mean Mike Evans is not a top 10 receiver by any stretch of the imagination. And I don't really get it, honestly. This is a high volume passing offense. This is the greatest quarterback of all time running this offense. And there's not much, honestly, for me to hate. I will say I've seen a lot of people love Tyler Johnson because they think he'll run a lot of routes in the slot. I don't necessarily agree with that take because Chris Godwin does line up there quite a bit. And we saw Gronk line up in the slot quite a bit in New England. So I think Gronk's going to move around the field a little bit, even though I'm not overly high on Gronk, which is probably a good segue. But Godwin and Evans, to me, are still no-brainer top 10 offensive wide receivers in terms of fantasy.
All right, yeah, great segue there too. Next up, we got the tight ends. 3 of them that they've seen some time on the field in this league before. Gronkowski is arguably, I mean, any kind of like graphic that you see or who's your top 5 tight ends in the history of the NFL, Gronkowski is on a lot of people's list. Maybe not number 1, but he's up there. O.J. Howard, he was a first-round pick, an early-round pick, so he's got all the potential. Cameron Brate, he's kind of been – I mean, he's actually probably been better than OJ Howard since OJ's
Hmm.
entered the league, but he's kind of taken a back seat with them signing Gronk, or trading for Gronk. But yeah, I mean, you could put a combination of any of these three, put two of them out there on the field, and you got some weapons, you got some targets. They can all catch the ball. Brate's probably the better blocker of the three. Gronk's
Hmm.
a really good blocker too, and I'm sure you were probably going to say that. So I'll leave a little bit of that for you. But I mean, it's you put Gronk out there, you put Brate out there. It's like adding a sixth offensive lineman, which is great for this offense because they need to protect Tom Brady.
Yeah, I agree with you. Gronk is I mean, we all talk about how he's one of the most prolific tight end pass catchers. I mean, he really is one of the best blocking tight ends of all time too, and that's one of the biggest things I've always respected about him. As much as I think he's a frat boy in a NFL player's body, I mean, he really works on his game and he takes it seriously, which is really, I mean, still mind-boggling to me if you ever hear an interview with the guy. But he I'm really interested to see how this tight end situation turns out because I have no idea if we're being honest. I mean, Bruce Arians' tight ends are never successful. I mean, he's never had a top 10 tight end, and this guy has been an offensive mind for like 50,000 years. And he's been coaching in the NFL, I think, from the early 80s now, and he's never had a top 10 tight end in terms of fantasy production. So that's bizarre to me. I mean, I don't trust any of them from a fantasy standpoint. Gronk's going as the ninth tight end off the board right now. I just think that's high. I mean, this is a guy, you can take it either way. Some people say that him coming off his long layoff here, he'll be rejuvenated, but I don't know. I mean, when we last saw Gronk, he was he couldn't stay on the field. He didn't look like himself, and I don't think that a year plus off the field is going to help him return to game shape necessary. I just don't buy that theory. I mean, he hasn't played in a game. You hear people talk a lot about being in game shape. There's no way he can be in game shape. He hasn't played in a game in forever. So, and not to mention, we don't love talking about injury prone, but Gronk has been very injury prone throughout the course of his career,
Mhm.
and I can't see that improving with him not playing for a few years. He hasn't taken a big hit in a while, so I don't have a lot of faith in Gronk, honestly, and a lot of it has to do with this offense. And a lot of people say, well, Tom Brady loves his tight ends. Yeah, but if Bruce Arians isn't going to run his offense that way, it doesn't really matter. And I love OJ High, and I would think they have to trade one of these guys. I mean, these are three tight ends. They should be starting. I mean, all three of these guys are starting caliber tight ends. And, it's funny that people are so high on Gronk because so many people were burned on OJ Howard last year in this offense.
Mhm.
This was a guy that was a consensus top 10 pick, and he had like 200 yards last season. And then people seem to be making the same mistake. I think Gronk will be a big red zone threat that OJ Howard wasn't last year, but I just can't see Gronk competing and having a ton of targets with Godwin and Evans and Howard and guys out of the backfield. I just can't see it. So I hate him going in the top 10, and I really don't believe that he'll finish there, especially in PPR leagues.
All right. Well, you have to. I mean, I agree, but you have to imagine that Tom Brady is going to have some input in that playbook and what he wants to do. So I think that
A
tight ends
little bit.
they're going to be more involved than what they were. But I do agree with you. That's not Bruce Arians type. One thing that we haven't talked about in any of these episodes yet so far, it just kind of just slipped our minds, but I'd like to bring it up now. Is they have a 2021 potential head coach candidate on this staff, and that's Byron Leftwich. I've seen his name thrown around.
Mhm.
Do you think he can lead a team next year?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen what he's done with an offense, and he's worked very closely with Bruce Arians. And, I don't really read too much into coach speak or what they say in press conferences, but Bruce Arians has been very public in saying Byron Leftwich will be a tremendous head coach. And the work that he's done with the quarterbacks has been impressive, which is kind of ironic considering Byron Leftwich's career. But yeah, I mean, that means a lot. I already mentioned Bruce Arians has been in this league for a long time, so I would definitely expect it. I mean, I think that Eric Bieniemy from Kansas City should get a shot over Byron Leftwich. I still can't believe that Joe Judge got a head coaching job over Eric Bieniemy coming from the Andy Reid coaching tree, coming off a Super Bowl, one of the most prolific offenses of, in a long time. And he can't get a head coaching job. But I think Byron Leftwich will have his chance, but it'll be a few years.
Okay. And then going into the special teams, not really much to talk about in the kick and punt return game. They got a handful of guys that are going to be back there. I guess it's kind of wait and see who starts taking some kicks and punts. In deeper leagues, like if you're starting 4, 5, 6 flexes, Justin Watson could be a name to look out for because he could see some time on the offensive side, and then he also might return some punts. And then Ronald Jones, obviously, he's already going to be drafted, so that's one of those things where if he's a starting running back in Tampa, you might get that added bonus in the kick return game. Our rankings came out for kickers. Matt Gay, he was ranked a little higher on some of our lists. I think one of our admins had him at number 1, and it's for good reason too. He's their kicker. It's a high-powered offense. He's going to get a lot of opportunity. He plays down in Florida, where they get a lot of wind, they get a lot of rain, so those games might be a little rough because it's an open-ended stadium or open-aired stadium. But they also play in New Orleans, who has a dome. Carolina's warm weather. Atlanta has a dome. So 11 other games at least are going to be warm weather, barring rain and tornado or hurricanes. It's going to be warm weather or dome. So, what do you think about Matt Gay?
Yeah, so he was the 4th kicker last year, and I don't think a lot of people realize that. And I had him as my number 1 kicker. I think that he in this offense can be, you already mentioned very favorable weather conditions. They'll probably be top 5 in terms of scoring, so he'll have lots of opportunity there. So I like him a lot. He's going as the 8th kicker off the board right now. So if you're looking at kicker ADP, he's a great value.
Yeah, he's gonna be one of the drafted ones, I'd imagine. Behind like your Justin Tuckers and Matt Praters. But moving on to the defense, this is probably my favorite front 7 in the entire league. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, they have probably the worst secondary in the entire league. Their secondary, I wouldn't say it's the worst, but it's pretty bad. But their front 7, just their front 7 alone, the opportunity to get sacks, the opportunity to pressure the quarterback, and hopefully the defensive backs can turn the ball over. I think they're a draftable defense if you're one of those guys that likes to draft defenses. I mean, they're going to have some streamable matchups too, but they also do play in the NFC South, where Atlanta, New Orleans can all move the ball. Carolina a little less. I mean, you have the threat of Christian McCaffrey back there, but we got to see how that offense gels together. But Atlanta and New Orleans are going to put some points up, so it might be tough to play the defense against them. Individually, though, they got one of the best linebacking cores. They got some defensive ends that could get to the quarterback. They got a nice big nose tackle there, Vita Vea, who was a first-round pick back in 2018. Levante David and Devin White, Shaq Barrett, that's their linebackers. I mean, Shaq Barrett had a career year last year coming over from Denver. Devin White was their first-round pick in 2019. He has been... He was, I mean, it was between like Devin White and Devin Bush were the top 2 linebackers last year, and I mean they both had pretty solid seasons. So I mean they probably wouldn't have gone wrong with either of them. But White's been really good. David has been doing it for years. I love this front 7, and there's a lot that you could say, but we are running a little short on time. So I would say, like, if you can get one of the front 7 in your IDPs, and you have to, I mean, especially the linebackers, you definitely want to go that route. But if you're looking at the defensive line, with Sue, Golston, and Vea, if you have to play specifically a defensive lineman, I'd go with any one of those 3 too, just because this defense is going to be good, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's a scary part about this team overall for me. You talk about all those offensive weapons with Tom Brady, and now we're talking about, I mean, this could be a top 5 defense. I mean, just quickly, I think this would surprise a lot of people, but from weeks 10 to 17, so the last 8 games of the season last year, Tampa Bay as a whole had the 2nd most fantasy points for a defensive unit, and I don't think a lot of people realize that. They were actually that good in terms of fantasy production and just in terms of playing in real life as well. So you already mentioned a lot of the names. On the defensive front, Ndamukong Suh, Vita Vea are more at this point, more real life assets than fantasy assets to me. You could argue Jason Pierre-Paul, if he has dual eligibility on the defensive line, might be worth something, but you're going to make a lot of your money in this linebacking core here. Devin White's a top 5 IDP pick, 91 tackles in 13 games. Levante David is 30 now, but he's played 8 seasons in the NFL. 7 of them he's had over 100 tackles, so you mentioned that consistency, and that's definitely true. Shaq Barrett had 19 and a half sacks last year, which I don't expect him to repeat that, but he's probably a good candidate to at least have 10 or 11 over double digits. I'll give him some respect there. Secondary, I'm not really touching anyone. One name that I will mention quickly if you're in a dynasty with IDPs is Antoine Winfield Jr. He was one of the first safeties off the board this year, and he really does it all. And he was a lot of scouts' #1 rated safety coming into the draft, and I think he's going to be an anchor on this defense for years to come. So I don't know if he's going to start. Right now he's listed as a backup, but if you have a taxi squad for ADPs, I really like Antoine Winfield.
Yeah, I know a lot of Denver Broncos fans are a little salty about Shaq Barrett going over to Tampa. But final thoughts on the Buccaneers. They finished 7-9 in their division last year, third place. You have to think that just Tom Brady alone coming in is gonna at least flip that record, if not add another win or two. So I would say 10-6, 11-5. Atlanta's defense really isn't that good, and we got their episode coming up soon. The Saints, I think, are still the #1 team in that division. They really didn't lose much, and they stayed consistent, and they won 13 games last year. But I think that Tampa is going to be like a 10-6, 11-5 team, second in that division, and make a wild card spot.
Yeah, I mean it's going to be a tight race. I think a lot of people have the Bucs pretty firmly in second, but I think it could go either way. I mean, I think on paper the Tampa Bay Buccaneers could have the best team in the NFL, and their defense is way better than anyone else in this division. So I wouldn't be surprised if they finish #1, but definitely a playoff team if they can't beat out the Saints for the division.
All right, so until the next episode, we'll see you then.